Long before the thunder of war rolled across Europe, one man was already listening for its distant rumble. It was the early 1930s, and Winston Churchill, out of office, out of favor, and largely dismissed as a relic of the past, sat alone in his Chartwell study, poring over reports that chilled him to the bone. He was no longer Britain's political darling. To many, he was a troublesome figure, obsessed with war, clinging to imperial dreams. But Churchill saw what others refused to see, a dark power rising across the Channel, cloaked in fiery speeches and iron discipline. He watched as Adolf Hitler transformed from a fringe agitator into the absolute ruler of Germany, and with each step, Churchill's alarm grew. The Weimar Republic was crumbling. German factories were humming again. Not for peace, but for rearmament. The Treaty of Versailles, that fragile promise of never again, was being shredded piece by piece. And yet Britain slumbered. Churchill tried to raise his voice in Parliament, warning that Hitler's ambition would not stop with Germany. The gathering storm, he called it. But he was laughed at, dismissed as a warmonger trying to relive the Great War. Politicians and the public alike wanted peace at any price. He found himself isolated, not for being wrong, but for being right too soon. Newspapers mocked him. His own party turned their backs. But even as the world drifted toward disaster, Churchill sharpened his pen and his resolve, knowing that history would one day prove him right, though by then it might be too late. By 1933, Hitler was Germany's chancellor, and Churchill's unease deepened into dread. From his seat on the backbenches, he listened as his colleagues spoke of reasonable cooperation with the new German government. They believed that Hitler could be moderated, that his aggression was mere posturing for domestic politics. Churchill disagreed violently. He had read Mein Kampf, something most of his peers had not. He saw, line by line, Hitler's blueprint for conquest. The racial hatred, the lust for revenge, the dream of a 1,000-year empire. It was all there in print. And yet, few wanted to believe that the horrors written in that book could ever leap into reality. He began gathering information, relying on friends within the military and intelligence services. Reports of new aircraft, vast armament programs, and secret training facilities in the German countryside confirmed his fears. He spoke in the Commons with growing urgency, urging Britain to rebuild its own defenses, particularly its air force. "We are entering a period of mortal danger," he warned. "The world is arming faster than we are." But the government wanted quiet. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin assured the public that rearmament was unnecessary, that Britain's security rested on peace and diplomacy. The newspapers applauded. Churchill's warnings, meanwhile, were labeled as hysteria. Even so, he persisted. In speeches, in essays, and in letters, he thundered against the blindness of his nation. "The malice of the wicked," he said bitterly, "is reinforced by the weakness of the virtuous." It was a lonely crusade. Yet he refused to yield, convinced that his country's survival depended on it. By 1935, the storm clouds Churchill had predicted were now visible to all, though many still refused to look. Germany had left the League of Nations, rebuilt its air force, and reinstated conscription, openly violating the Treaty of Versailles. Across Europe, fascism was spreading like a fever, Mussolini in Italy, Franco rising in Spain, while the democracies of the West clung desperately to appeasement. Churchill spent his nights writing, warning through newspapers and broadcasts that the world was sleepwalking into catastrophe. His speeches were electric, but the House of Commons remained unmoved. They preferred the illusion of peace to the discomfort of truth. In 1936, when Hitler marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, Britain and France could have stopped him with a single show of force. Instead, they did nothing. Hitler later admitted that if the Allies had resisted, he would have withdrawn. But no one resisted, and the dictator took it as a sign from destiny itself. Churchill's fury was volcanic. "Each one hopes," he said in Parliament, "that if he feeds the crocodile enough, the crocodile will eat him last." Yet he could not break through the fog of denial that gripped his countrymen. Britain was tired of war, broke from the Depression and desperate to believe that Hitler's ambitions were limited. But Churchill knew better. He knew that once dictators tasted blood, they never stopped. In his quiet hours at Chartwell, he wrote to a friend, "I see dreadful things coming, and I feel powerless to prevent them." It was a rare admission of despair from the man who would one day hold his nation together by sheer will. By 1937, Winston Churchill stood almost completely alone. He had no office, no influence, and few allies left in Parliament. His party, weary of his warnings, saw him as a distraction from the calm they wished to maintain. The newspapers called him yesterday's man, a relic of the Great War clinging to ghosts. But Churchill had something his peers lacked, a relentless conviction that truth was worth isolation. At Chartwell, his home in Kent, he worked late into the night, poring over German industrial reports, Air Force estimates, and foreign correspondence. He used his network of military insiders, retired officers, and civil servants to gather information the government itself often ignored. Through this web, he knew that Hitler's Luftwaffe was expanding at an astonishing pace, nearly 5 times larger than Britain's Royal Air Force. When he brought these figures to Parliament, the reaction was not gratitude but hostility. "You are frightening people unnecessarily," one MP snapped. Another accused him of fabricating numbers to stir panic. But Churchill's sources were correct. He knew that every month Britain delayed rearming, Germany grew stronger. Still, the people wanted peace. They remembered the mud, the gas, the millions dead in the trenches. They wanted no more war, no more sacrifice. To them, Churchill's warning sounded like madness. He was the old general calling for another fight. The truth, that another fight was coming whether they wanted it or not, was too unbearable to accept. Even his friends began to drift away. Invitations to dinner grew rare. Editors refused his articles. But Churchill's pen did not stop. "The era of procrastination," he wrote in 1938, "of half measures and delays, of soothing and baffling expedients is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences." Few noticed his words then, but they would echo in history. In March 1938, Hitler made his boldest move yet, annexing Austria in the so-called Anschluss. The world watched as German troops rolled across the border to cheering crowds. Britain and France protested, but their words carried no weight. Churchill, meanwhile, felt his heart sink. "The lights are going out once more," he wrote in his diary. At that moment, he knew the last chance to stop Hitler without war was fading. Austria's fall emboldened the Nazi regime, and Churchill warned that Czechoslovakia would be next. "Each conquest," he said, "feeds the appetite for the next." But Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed otherwise. He saw Hitler as a man with limited ambitions, a nationalist, not a conqueror. Chamberlain sought peace through diplomacy, convinced that reasonable men could reason with dictators. That autumn, Chamberlain flew to Munich to meet Hitler. When he returned waving a piece of paper promising "peace for our time," Britain erupted in relief. Crowds cheered, newspapers celebrated, and Chamberlain became a hero. Churchill stood in Parliament, his face grave. "You were given the choice between war and dishonor," he said bitterly. "You chose dishonor, and you will have war." His words were drowned in applause for Chamberlain. Few wanted to hear him. To most of Britain, Churchill's grim prophecy seemed almost cruel. But within months his warning came true. In March 1939, Hitler swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. The Peace of Munich was exposed as a lie, and Churchill's voice, once mocked, began to sound like the voice of reason. It was a small vindication, but a heavy one, for he took no joy in being right. Every step toward war confirmed not triumph, but tragedy. By the summer of 1939, Churchill's warnings could no longer be dismissed. German panzers were massing near Poland. Hitler's rhetoric grew more violent, and secret reports revealed plans of invasion. Britain's newspapers, once mocking Churchill as paranoid, now printed his words with new respect. The tone had changed. Fear was spreading. In September, when Hitler invaded Poland, the illusion of peace shattered. Britain and France declared war. And suddenly the man who had spent a decade crying out in the wilderness was no longer a nuisance but a prophet. Churchill was brought back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same post he had held in World War I. The Admiralty sent out a simple message to the fleet: "Winston is back." At last, his country had turned to him. But victory brought no joy, only grim vindication. In private, he was haunted by the knowledge that the disaster might have been prevented. All had been foreseen, he told a friend. Nothing was done. His long struggle to be heard had cost him years of ridicule, but it had also forged him into the leader Britain would soon need more than ever. When Londoners looked to the skies and saw German bombers, they no longer doubted Churchill's foresight. The man who had been mocked as a doomsayer now stood as the nation's shield. Yet, in those early days of war, he carried not triumph, but sorrow. "If only they had listened," he murmured one night, as the first air raid sirens began to wail. The war he had tried so hard to prevent was now upon them, and Churchill's greatest test was only beginning. As the war consumed Europe, Churchill's return to power was both a redemption and a reckoning. The very people who had once cast him aside now relied on him for guidance, and though the vindication was total, it came at the cost of millions already suffering under Nazi rule. His first days back at the Admiralty were marked by urgency. Telegrams flying, fleets mobilizing, and the old machinery of war grinding to life. He walked through the Admiralty's corridors like a man reborn, but his eyes held the weight of prophecy fulfilled too late. "I have not become the king's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire," he declared to his colleagues, his voice trembling not from fear but from restrained fury. The years of being ignored had hardened him, but they had also refined him. The restless politician had become a man of destiny. Across Britain, the mood was grim. Blackout curtains hung in every window. Gas masks were issued to children, and trenches were dug in public parks. People remembered his warnings, those speeches about Hitler's hunger for domination, and realized they had laughed at a man who had seen the truth before anyone else. Now they turned to him as their last defense against oblivion. When the Blitz began, Churchill walked through bombed neighborhoods waving his hat to cheering crowds. To them, he was not merely a politician. He was proof that courage could exist in human form. But inside, he felt the ghosts of his wilderness years whispering. They had to see the fire to believe it burned. The same Parliament that once dismissed him now listened in silence when he spoke. His words carried the power of vindication, and the sorrow of knowing that foresight, without action, changes nothing. In the quiet moments between cabinet meetings, Churchill would sometimes reflect on the long decade before the war, the speeches that fell on deaf ears, the laughter in Parliament, the editorials mocking his obsession with Hitler. It had not only been a political struggle, it was a moral one. He understood something others refused to, that evil unchecked never stops on its own. He had not possessed secret knowledge or divine insight. What he had was intuition sharpened by history. He knew how men like Hitler thought, not because he admired them, but because he had studied their patterns in the rise of tyrants past. He had watched the Kaiser's Germany before 1914 and knew how ambition could masquerade as patriotism. To him, Hitler's ascent was not shocking. It was inevitable once the world began to value comfort over courage. Now, as the bombs fell on London, Churchill's old speeches were reprinted in newspapers. Words once ridiculed became prophetic scripture. Ordinary citizens clipped them from the pages, quoting lines that spoke to their suffering. "We must arm. Britain must wake." Yet Churchill took no pleasure in being right. He had seen too much death in his life to feel triumph in prophecy. His mission was no longer to be believed. It was to win. Still, he carried with him the bitter reminder of what happens when warnings go unheeded. "If you will not fight when your victory will be sure," he said once, "you may come to the moment when you must fight with every chance of losing." That moment had come. And now the price of disbelief was being paid in fire and blood. As Britain braced for its darkest hour, Churchill's old speeches became a lifeline, evidence that someone had seen the storm before it broke. Reporters began calling him the man who saw tomorrow. To many, it seemed almost supernatural, as though he had peered through the fog of politics and glimpsed the shape of destiny. But Churchill himself dismissed such talk. "I only read the signs," he said quietly. They were there for all to see. He believed deeply that history left clues, and that ignoring them was humanity's greatest folly. The rise of Hitler had not been sudden. It had been a march in plain view. Every treaty broken, every military parade, every silenced newspaper in Germany was a warning flare. But the world had chosen to look away. Now, as the fires of London lit the night, Churchill's voice became the only steady thing left in a collapsing world. "We shall not flag or fail," he said in one of his most famous speeches. "We shall go on to the end." The irony was cruel. The man who had once begged his country to prepare for this war now begged it to endure it. And yet, that endurance, that refusal to surrender, became Britain's salvation. The lonely prophet had become the voice of defiance. He no longer warned of storms. He led his people through them. But even then, in the quiet after his speeches, he often sat in silence, the smoke from his cigar curling into the dim light. The knowledge that he had been right brought no comfort. For Churchill understood, perhaps better than anyone, that prophecy is a burden, and foresight, without faith from others, is the loneliest kind of genius. By 1941, the world finally saw what Churchill had seen in 1933. Hitler's armies had swallowed Europe, and even the Soviet Union, once thought untouchable, was reeling under the assault of Operation Barbarossa. In Washington and London, Churchill's speeches were broadcast across the Atlantic, and the same newspapers that had once mocked him now hailed him as the only man who never doubted. But vindication is rarely sweet. As he sat in his underground war rooms, watching the red lines of German advance stretch across maps, Churchill often muttered to his staff, "I only wish they had listened when there was still time." He carried the ghosts of the years wasted in debate, the missed chances to confront Hitler when he was still weak, the lives that could have been spared. He never gloated, never said, "I told you so." Instead, his resolve hardened. Every bombing raid on London, every telegram reporting another sunken convoy reminded him that foresight was useless without action. His burden was not only to fight Hitler, it was to make the world believe again that evil, once unleashed, must be met head-on. Churchill's vindication, therefore, was not triumph. It was tragedy. The years he spent in political exile had prepared him for war, but they had also shown him the fragility of truth in a world addicted to comfort. To him, the war was proof that civilization itself had to be defended, not only from bombs and armies but from the blindness of its own leaders. That was the lesson he carried each night into his war rooms, that the world's greatest danger is not ignorance, but the refusal to see. As German bombers roared overhead, Churchill's voice became Britain's shield. The people who had once dismissed his warnings now clung to his every word. His speeches were not polished or theatrical. They were human, raw, full of the thunder of conviction and the tremor of weariness. "You ask, what is our policy?" He had said, "It is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us." Each phrase carried the weight of his years in isolation. A man who had spoken truth to deaf ears now speaking hope to a desperate nation. The irony was profound. The same courage that had made him an outcast now made him indispensable. Outside his office, London burned. Bombs flattened entire neighborhoods, but the people refused to yield. They painted slogans on walls, "We can take it," and carried on with life under the constant wail of sirens. Churchill saw in them the same defiance he had carried in Parliament years earlier. "If you're going through hell," he once said, "keep going." He often traveled to the bomb sites himself, walking through rubble-strewn streets, his hat tipped, his cigar clenched in his teeth. Ordinary Britons would cheer as he passed. "Good old Winnie," and for a brief moment he was no longer the politician who had been ignored. He was the spirit of their endurance, the voice that refused to fall silent even as the world around him seemed to. And yet, he never forgot how quickly faith could fade. "The people are with me now," he once confided to his secretary. But they were not before the storm came. When victory finally came in 1945, Churchill stood before a cheering nation, a symbol of survival and strength. But behind the applause lay a haunting truth. His warnings about Hitler had been right, yet too late. And now, even in victory, he sensed another shadow forming, one that would soon divide the world again. He watched the uneasy alliance between the West and the Soviet Union fracture. He saw Stalin's ambition rising, the Iron Curtain descending across Europe, and realized that history's cycle was repeating itself. In 1946, at Fulton, Missouri, Churchill gave another speech, one that echoed the lonely courage of his warnings a decade before. "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic," he declared, "an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Once again, he was mocked by many, called paranoid, accused of trying to stir fear where peace had just been won. But Churchill no longer cared for approval. He had lived through the cost of disbelief once, and he would not remain silent again. As the Cold War began to take shape, his prophecy once more proved true. The man who had foreseen Hitler's rise had now foreseen the next great conflict of ideologies. His mind, restless and unyielding, refused to accept that peace was permanent. In his final years, Churchill often spoke of history as a whispering companion, a voice that warns, pleads, and remembers even when men forget. For him, prophecy was not prediction. It was the discipline of memory, and in that he was never wrong. In his twilight years, Churchill often sat alone in Chartwell, his beloved countryside home, gazing over the quiet ponds he had built by hand. The war was over, yet peace felt fragile, too fragile. The same man who had rallied the world now found himself surrounded by silence. His body was aging, but his mind refused to rest. "I am ready to meet my Maker," he once said, "but whether my Maker is prepared for the ordeal of meeting me is another matter." There was irony in his solitude. The man who had been ignored before the war was now celebrated as one of the greatest leaders in history. Yet he remained haunted by the world's tendency to forget its lessons. Visitors described him as alternately charming and brooding, reminiscing about the battles he had fought, the men he had led, and the warnings that had cost millions of lives to be understood. He often reread his speeches from the 1930s, underlining passages where he had pleaded for vigilance. To him, they were not triumphs, but epitaphs for the lives lost because the truth had come too late. In quiet moments, he admitted to friends that victory had never erased the sting of being ignored when it mattered. Most, Churchill understood something. Few men ever do. That being right ahead of your time is often indistinguishable from being wrong. And though the world now revered him, the echo of those lonely years still followed him. For Churchill, vindication had never been enough. What he had wanted, always, was to be heard. The post-war years brought Churchill new honors, but also new frustrations. He returned to power in 1951, older and frailer, yet still defiant. He dreamed of preserving peace through unity, warning once again that the balance of power was shifting. But this time, his words lacked the urgency they once carried. The world was tired of prophecy. It wanted comfort, not caution. When he addressed Parliament about the dangers of nuclear proliferation and the rise of Soviet influence, many nodded politely and dismissed him as an old man clinging to old fears. But history, as it always did, began to echo him once more. Korea, Berlin, and the atomic arms race proved that Churchill's sense of foreboding had not faded with Hitler's defeat. It had simply evolved. Those who worked with him in these years often spoke of his melancholic wisdom. Between speeches, he would fall silent for long stretches, lost in thought. His secretaries recalled how he would stare into the distance and murmur, "They never learn, never." It was the burden of a prophet, to see too far, too clearly, and to be condemned to watch others walk blind into the same mistakes. For Churchill, history was not a sequence of victories and defeats. It was a cycle of warnings unheeded and lessons forgotten. In many ways, his life's tragedy was the world's tragedy, that humanity listens only when the cost of ignorance becomes unbearable. In 1965, the world mourned as Winston Churchill's coffin was carried down the Thames, the river that had flowed beside every chapter of his life. Warships lined the banks, their flags lowered in silence, their sirens echoing through the mist like a final salute to the man who had refused to be silent in the face of evil. Heads of state, soldiers, and ordinary citizens gathered to honor him, not just as a leader, but as a voice of conscience in an age that had nearly lost its own. As the procession moved, one journalist wrote, "The man who warned us too early now sleeps too late." Churchill's life had been a storm of conviction. Brilliant, flawed, unrelenting. He had been doubted, ridiculed, vindicated, and finally immortalized. But his greatest legacy was not victory, nor even courage. It was foresight, the rare gift to see the gathering clouds before the first drop of rain. And yet, his greatest fear remained, that once again the world would forget. For in the end, Churchill's story is not just about one man's warnings. It is about the eternal struggle between truth and comfort, between those who see danger and those who choose not to. His words still echo across time, a reminder that freedom's greatest enemy is not tyranny, but complacency. And perhaps if he could speak once more, Churchill would repeat the same plea he made long before the bombs fell. Learn from history, or you will relive it.